and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. In this session, we will be plunging into the opportunities and challenges in the waste to value sector in India. Just want to make a small note to the audience here. We have a panel session on sustainable mobility deep dive in Audi 1 going on. So please feel free to switch between Audis and attend the session of your choice. Research shows that more than 50% of the waste produced in India ends up in landfills due to inefficient waste management systems. COVID-19 has made waste handling even more precarious in India as biomedical waste gets mixed up with household waste. There exist quite a few gaps in the current waste management ecosystem, such as fragmented supply chains, lack of source segregation and collection, inefficient waste treatment processing, etc., all of them creating an untapped opportunity for new innovations and startups. Today, we have a stellar panel who will take us through the nuances of the waste to value sector in context of startups in India. We have Aditi Gupta, Principal Investments at Asha Impact, who will be moderating the session. Asha Impact was founded in 2014 by a network of like-minded business leaders and philanthropists to leverage their collective expertise, networks, and capital for social impact. It has two arms, one which operates as an impact investment platform and another as a policy advocacy trust. We have Anurag Agarwal, partner Avishkar Capital. Avishkar Capital is one of the pioneers in India in impact investing space in India and has been investing in early growth stage enterprises since 2001, with a focus on geographies and sectors that were often overlooked and challenged. Next up is Manas Rath. He is a senior advisor at Boda and also India country lead at Take a Stake. Take a Stake targets a specific SME segment, small and growing businesses that are not being served by microfinance institutions since the required investment amount is too large, neither by banks because their investment need is too small for them. We then have Wolfgang Heffenmeier, founding partner Sagana. Sagana has a dedicated team of investors, thinkers, and doers working to unleash the potential of people, capital, and business to create a better future for all. We have Sandeep Patel, co-founder NEPRA. NEPRA specializes in the collection, segregation, processing, and recycling of local dry waste, including plastic. I now hand it over to you, Aditi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipanshi. So let me, kick things off by adding a little more context to what Dipanshi mentioned on what's the current state of waste management in our country and why it's imperative that we look at this from the lens of private sector innovation. So India set an ambitious growth target of being a 5 trillion economy by 2030. And on our way to that, at some point, we will also become the most populous nation in the world. This economic growth and the accompanying urbanization will bring with it many challenges, not the least of which is waste management. As a country today, unfortunately, we have an inadequate system of waste disposal and management. Like Dipanshi also mentioned, out of the roughly 62 million tons of waste that's generated annually, only about 70% gets collected and only a quarter gets treated, which means that the majority of waste goes untreated in heaps, in landfills, and in drains and in water bodies. Years of this system of neglect and absence of urban planning has left us staring at large landfills and choked water bodies. If we continue down this path, there are estimates that we would need landfills the size of roughly Bengaluru to handle India's waste crisis. From a global perspective, you could say, well, this is a local issue, why should we care? But environmental issues hardly ever are local in their consequence. The Ganges as a river is among the top 10 most polluting rivers in the world and contributes very highly to the amount of plastic going into the world's oceans. Interestingly, global benchmarks also tell us that an average American produces about 8 times more municipal solid waste than an Indian does on a per capita level, because both the patterns of consumption and the levels of consumption look very different. And yet, Western cities and the streets look much cleaner than the story Indian streets have to tell. Our belief is that the government is really doing its part with programs like the Swachh Bharat Mission, but it's now up to engage citizens in private sector innovation to now step up. This session is designed to do exactly that, traverse perspectives from both entrepreneurs and investors, and dig deeper into what is possibly a $15 billion worth of waste to value opportunity. So Sandeep, let me start with you. You started NEPRA almost a decade ago. What was your inspiration, you and your co-founders, to take up this challenge, even in the absence of any catalytic regulation or any examples of peer, private sector business models?
So, thanks, Aditi. And I think looking back, it has been a journey, and the whole struggle started when we started seeing waste management not really making an impact. And wherever we could see, it was either plastics or cloth, everything. Where you see there is a landfill or a dump site. And when we used to go and talk to people who were composting, they had problem of plastics or cloth in their material. When we talked with various recyclers, they were always complaining about not having good quality input material. So we always felt the problem of waste was because of non-existent structured value chain, and quantum of waste was never a problem. So when we were looking for creating that value chain, we spent so much time understanding it, and we realized not many people were very keen to do it, and there was less competition. So one thing definitely was it was very tough to do, to connect all the dots, make efforts behind creating those relationships, partnerships, and efforts to really prove those value chain. So we knew that this was going to be a struggle, but if it was possible to do it, then the impact or the scale at which this problem exists, there is a big opportunity. And while we were doing other things before we started waste management, those businesses are already crowded enough with too much competition, infrastructure, and all. And as an entrepreneur, I was always looking at things which nobody else was looking, and I could, really identify opportunities in challenges where people were facing. So it was just looking at the problems which people were having, and trying to identify a solution around it. And I think it passed by day, where we realized we couldn't solve everything on day one, but we started the journey creating value chain, asking people about what challenges they would want solved in the waste streams, and more importantly, every commodity at a time. So we could solve paper very early in the value chain, but we struggled a lot with plastic. And I think while we were doing that, we had a lot of other challenges of a fire in early stage of business, people issues, and training and all that thing. So lucky to start very early, because we had all the time of making all the mistakes, and worst the luck could call it is fire also. So today I can smile about it, but I remember that day when I had to talk with Vineet about the fire, and I still remember those days where it was told that okay, good, it happened very early, because now we have opportunity to learn and improve. So our journey has been about creating better standards and practices of creating that value chain, practices of operations, at the same time people practices as well. So I think we had enough time to build that, and that's where I feel that it was lucky that we looked at the opportunity very early, kept on building on it, and we were lucky to have support all the way from the journey from Avishkar, you guys, and now Wolfgang and the team as well. So it's a journey which cannot be converted into a small time, but I think creating a value chain has been a great experience.
Great, Sandeep, and I'm going to circle back to you on a couple of aspects of that journey. But Anurag, for the sake of chronology, let me come to you now. You were one of the earliest investors to step into the waste management space and say, this is going to become formalized over the years and needs to be done, and capital will find commensurate returns to the risk that it's taking on. But how did Avishkar as a firm get the conviction to do this almost a decade ago, before there were any sort of peers doing this? And what have sort of been your understanding of the space and innovations that you've seen in the ecosystem in the subsequent decade as well?
Yeah, so I think Avishkar is known to be slightly ahead of the times in terms of spotting opportunities. So we came from from the impact angle, right? We identified this as a big problem, and Avishkar is a thesis-based investor. So we identified it as a big problem even before the Swachh Bharat mission was launched, and before this was really top of the mind or top priority from a government or from a investor excitement point of view. But we were looking at we had identified the problem, we understood that if you can solve the problem in a business format, it can create a lot of impact on the ground, and it's a big enough problem so that if you do it well, it can create a lot of value also. So that was the theory, but the practical aspect of how do you have a business. We were also wary that a lot of waste management in India is really the lifting and shifting kind, where you move the problem from one place to another. So that's what we were mostly coming across, and most of these were essentially government-facing businesses who were dependent on the government for their revenues, which was in our playbook a strict no-no. Right? We wanted to avoid getting into such businesses. So we were scanning the country for business models, and our team came across Sandeep and Dhrumin and team who were at least in concept trying to do something which was aligned, and we thought it's a bet worth taking. So we decided to back these guys, and like Sandeep said, we had a pretty false start with a fire very soon after our investment. So that did shake the confidence, but by the time this has happened, we had seen enough in terms of opportunity, and we were fairly convinced that we need to continue backing these guys. So in spite of that, at least in our mind, there was no doubt that this is a very good opportunity, and more importantly, a very good team to back. Right. So we continue to invest further capital with conviction. I'm very happy to state that NEPRA today is the largest. Anushka has made about 70 odd investments. It is the largest single investment that Anushka has made across multiple funds. So that just shows the level of conviction we have on this opportunity, and we intend to continue backing these guys even further. So our belief is that there is a lot of talk of unicorn. We can create a unicorn in this space, and that will be validation by itself. So
awesome. So Anurag setting that benchmark really high upfront. Manas, let me turn to you now. Because with NEPRA and with a lot of other businesses, we've seen plays in the dry waste management space, because there is already a market on the buyer side. You've worked in development across different areas over the years, and now work in the area of wastewater management, sewage, and you've worn both an operator and funder hat. So tell us a little bit about the waste management landscape beyond dry waste management, where you have a lot of experience in.
Absolutely great, yeah. So I wear two hats, maybe three. At Borda, which is a German NGO, we've been working in wastewater treatment and reuse in India for the last about 15 or 16 years. There's a very large sector in there. So I call water the other single-use resource, right? After plastic. We spend a lot of money bringing it in. We use it for often a microsecond or don't even use it productively. And then it's kind of gone. It goes into the environment, but it's, there's a lot of money spent behind it. Today, just like on the waste side, you've got regulations that require large waste generators to do on-site segregation or on-site treatment even especially of the wet waste. Similarly, there are regulations that large wastewater generators have to do on-site treatment, and then they can reuse that wastewater. And given the kind of water crisis we're starting to see, which is only going to get worse, we are seeing new technologies coming in where people are developing more and more automated wastewater treatment plants, for example, going to smaller sizes. So, many years ago, a plant that treated 50,000 liters or 25,000 liters was just considered too small per day, was considered too small to be economically viable. But today you see people having automated systems, which are literally plug and play. You bring a box, you put it in the ground, you plug the pipe in, and you turn it on, and it will just run for years and years with very little maintenance to treat the wastewater. And that means you're creating fresh water. And that means your infrastructure cost to pipe more water comes down. The kind of places you're extracting water from, that comes down. So we're seeing a lot of technology innovation happening. There are actually a lot of companies that are coming up. It's just kind of been outside the impact investment purview for whatever reasons. But I think we're going to see that starting to change, because there's more and more understanding that there are business opportunities in wastewater. Now, there is some amount of regulatory work that is required, because, for example, regulations require zero liquid discharge, which means that technically you cannot sell your treated wastewater, right? But now cities are saying, look, for construction activities, for greenification, for landscaping, why can't we take these, if a building, for example, has let's say a mall, an apartment building has got its own wastewater sewage treatment plant, why can't we take out the surplus water either by pipe or truck and use it for other productive uses? Because they'll only reuse a certain percentage for, let's say, flushing or air conditioning, right? And I think so we need to see some regulatory changes along these fronts. But I think there's a lot of work that is going on in terms of setting up standards, evaluating technologies, looking at pollution control, norms. And so I think we'll see a lot more activity over there also on the wastewater treatment side. And I think it's just as important as the solid waste side. We're also looking at fecal sludge management, which looks at the black water from a hygiene and a sanitation and a health perspective. There, the business opportunities are much harder to come across because there's a lot of government involvement, and generally when municipalities play a big role, it's kind of unpredictable for businesses and investors. But we are seeing hybrid annuity contracts, public-private partnerships, which I think over time will become more and more investable, especially by impact investors who are willing to take a little more risk than what other people might be willing to take.
Got it. Very interesting, Manas, and we'll sort of circle back and double click on that since you're basically telling the rest of us that this is where the next gold mine is. So as investors, you really need to be keenly watching out for this space and innovation there. But Wolfgang, let me sort of bring you into the conversation at this point. At Circulate Capital, you guys have very successfully raised a fund dedicated towards plastic recycling. Right, and you've brought in LPs like PepsiCo and Unilever and P&G, the likes of whom have never been capital providers as fund-of-fund operators anywhere in the past. So tell us a little bit about, what is the conversation at a global stage like at this point towards waste management, and where does India sort of fit in that sort of interest stack and innovation stack, I'd say?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Aditya. Thanks a lot for the invitation and being here. Great pleasure. I guess we're still working on one of the last gold mines, which is plastic, not on water yet. But maybe before I go into that, Dipanji was introducing me as a co-founder of Sagana, which is a global impact investing company. That's true, but I think the more relevant responsibility for this discussion here is that I'm part of the leadership team of Circulate Capital, an investment asset manager that Rob Kaplan founded in 2018. And Circulate Capital was founded with the explicit goal to avoid that more plastic leaks into the ocean. And so everything we do with our first 100 million fund is invest in companies that help us solve that problem. And we're trying to solve that problem first and foremost in Asia, where we are focused on. So we did about 6 investments over the last 2 years in India, invested 40 million there, and have another 2 which are hopefully closed over the next 2 months. We have our IC approval for that. And similarly, we're investing in Southeast Asia to solve the problem there as well. And so I guess that responsibility on the one hand side, being responsible mainly for the Indian investments, is relevant for discussion, but I wouldn't exclude also the responsibility for the innovation investments, which we do globally with our second fund, where we try to avoid that plastic is even used, where we go into alternative materials and alternative models, which is a solution way before we have that plastic out there. And maybe last but not least, might be interesting for you to know that Asia has been so successful over the last 2 years that we replicate that model in Latin America and working on setting up a similar fund as we did in Asia next year in Latin America, which gives you an indication that we're happy that we found really exciting entrepreneurs like Sandeep and his team in Asia, that we can help solve that problem, because we as investors, we can for sure not solve it ourselves. We need teams, good teams on the ground, good companies on the ground. And luckily in India, we've found a number of them, and we're quite proud to be able to support them in whatever is possible. Now, you asked the question, why are these large corporates engaging in that sector? I mean, For those of you who don't know, but Circulate Capital's first 100 million fund was supported by large corporates like Unilever, Danone, P&G, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dow, CP Chem. And I mean, I guess it's not a surprise that all of these companies, or most of these companies, use plastic as packaging. And they use a lot of that as packaging, a lot. And they also know that when they bring that plastic into the world, they have to also take a responsibility for not destroying the environment with that. And I think the reason, or the major reason why they basically ask us to help them solve that problem is because they know their responsibility. They know that a lot of that plastic was ending up in places where no one wants that plastic to end up. And they also know that there is nowadays technologies that help us to basically recycle most of that plastic in a way that it can be reused. And honestly, we all also know that plastic is a petroleum-based product. So everything that's petroleum-based has a climate impact. And it's obvious that if we can recycle that material, there's a huge positive climate impact coming on top of just the fact that we keep that plastic out of the environment where it doesn't belong to. And I guess that combination of them knowing that they will need more and more packaging material going forward, them knowing that they need high quality recycling infrastructures to be able to reuse more and more of that material was their motivation to come along with us. Of course, maybe a last point there, they've also given large global commitments that they would use a lot of recycled material. And they know the different countries well enough to know that the infrastructure at the moment is not there, that we're just at the beginning of building all of that infrastructure.
Thanks, Wolfgang. It's so good to hear that there's an area in which we're leading the way. And you mentioned that there's innovation that now is traveling to LATAM from the India experience, rather than, us looking at a consumer tech business and saying, oh, tell us the China comparable for it. So really refreshing to hear that. Sandeep, let me circle back to you. It's a point that you spoke of and Manas also hinted at, that regulation has a very large role to play in the space of waste management, right? Even in NEPRA's journey, we've seen the Swachh Bharat mission causing really an inflection point in the rate of growth in the business that we've seen over the last few years. So what is the state of regulation in the overall space according to you, and what are areas of improvement? And also tell us a little bit more about the EPR regulation, which is looked at as a massive opportunity area, including by the corporates that Wolfgang was speaking of. But there's still a lot more to do there. So is it the absence of adequate or rightly framed regulation, or is it adherence that's lacking?
So, I will start with the time we started the business. There was no regulation as such. There were very old rules of 2000, which were, yet to be reframed and restructured. And it was also tough for us to explain, apart from investors like Avishkar and all, those who did not spend enough time, they would not understand what the business really was. And in 4 years, once Mr. Modi came into and declared about Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and within 2 years, by 2016, when they talked about the new rules, the draft rules which came in, where they revamped all the possible rules which had existed, including solid waste management rules as well as plastic waste management rules. When rule came in, everybody was still struggling to say, okay, this is not possible, that is not possible. So almost 2 years went by. Where Swachh Bharat was intended to be done, the collection really needed to start happening, but really on the ground on treatment and processing was not really moving. And from 2016 to 2018, most of the waste generators who fall into PWM applicable registrations or EPR liability, they were still trying to walk away from the owning up to the responsibility, trying to understand if they really need to do it. And it took almost 2.5 years, and then a little bit of strictness from NGT, National Green Tribunal, and CPCB, and everybody started acting. So we have seen a lot of traction coming in last 2-3 years. The large players did start doing some bit of execution just to showcase their commitment and doing it. With last 1 year, the EPR liability, extended producer responsibility liability, is 100% execution of the material of plastic they put into market. So suddenly there has been a huge need of EPR execution requirement. More importantly, because there are still very few people who have registered for it. So now you can imagine India consumes almost 22 lakh metric tons of plastic every year. When you have to execute 100% of that EPR year on year basis, we are talking about a huge market opportunity just to collect plastic waste from the country, and it can actually support Swachh Bharat and the Clean India movement. In fact, it will also create a lot of infrastructure for recycling, replacement of virgin plastic material for high-grade applications. And we are seeing those tractions now happening. The dialogues are actually moving in those directions. And as more registrations come into play, more executions will also happen. So I think whenever there's a new law comes in, it takes time for people to understand and adapt. And also it takes time for the government to close all the doors for escapism as well. So, it's both ways. It's a to and fro movement which happens for a few years. And by the time it closes, then the action really starts. And I think the time for action is now started. And next couple of years, we will be seeing a lot of activity happening on plastic take back, plus replacement of virgin plastic with recycled content one. And we are seeing a lot of kind of infrastructure coming in across the country for better processing of plastic waste. So it's not just going to be traditional way where plastic was processed and used for any application, but plastic to be reprocessed and used for the same application it was earlier used for is something where the trend is really moving towards now.
Understood. So it's really the role of regulation and also progressive sort of brands and manufacturers who've stepped up and started adhering to this.
I would say it's like getting the music into rhythm. So every stakeholder playing different tune, they were trying to escape from doing this. So every stakeholder had to really align to each other, and I think that momentum started where infrastructure is also being created to align to that. So there is a need which has been created because of the law which came in. The intention of the people who are supposed to spend on it, the EPR liability and all, now that is getting aligned because they have realized there is no escapism from really doing their liability execution. Infrastructure need has suddenly created, so there is huge demand for recycled content plastic as well as infrastructure for waste management. So I think now a lot of momentum is now there for waste management companies, and a lot of infrastructure will also be created for plastic recycling for high-end applications as well.
Got it. So, Manas, let me turn to you with that same perspective, right? Where does regulation, stand when it comes to wastewater treatment and wet waste management? Because we've seen over the years that this varies vastly from a city to city level. So, Bangalore has been more progressive. Bombay is doing its part now. So as an investor, it becomes really hard to take a bet on a company where you don't really know what is the kind of ecosystem they will find as they go beyond one city. So where are you seeing, bottlenecks on the regulatory front in that business?
Absolutely. So I think, so the direction though is very clear, right? The direction, like with solid waste, there'll be hiccups, there'll be back and forth, but the direction is only in one direction. And with water as well, with wastewater, you're going to see more and more enforcement, more regulation and more enforcement of those that people have to clean the dirty water before they discharge it, whether it's municipalities or it is large users of water. I think on the regulation side, there are two issues that are still floating around. One is the discharge norms. To what level do you need to treat the water before you can discharge it? And this is important because your cost of the treatment plant as well as its operating and maintenance cost depends on the standards. So if you make the standards too tight, the cost of treatment goes up. The desire by people to bypass the law or to work their way around it therefore increases. So we need to find a balance where we are being responsible towards the environment, but we are also making sure that it's affordable and viable for people to actually pay that cost and to run it. And there's been some back and forth on that. I think there are the very good cases we can use from UK and from other countries where, depending on the amount of water you're discharging and the kind of application you have, you set standards accordingly. And therefore, it also, you adjust the cost for a particular party to treat that water. The second is the enforcement. You mentioned Bangalore. So what it took in Bangalore is that there was the head of the Pollution Control Board, I believe, who essentially filed FIRs and got the head of the chief engineer, and the head of the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board, along with municipal officers, thrown into jail for a few days. And that is when Bangalore started taking the implementation of small-scale wastewater treatment plants seriously. Today, they've got probably 3,000-4,000 small-scale sewage treatment plants in buildings, malls, apartments, etc., with a fairly high percentage of wastewater treatment. So you can have almost a 50-60% reduction in your freshwater requirement if you implement good quality treatment and reuse. So I think other cities are falling behind. I mean, this is basically the implementation problem. We need to strengthen the pollution control boards, give them money. I mean, they could earn a massive surplus just by implementing this one law. That could cover your cost of pollution control, to a large extent. So I think it'll gain traction. I think we need a few more court cases, a few more police cases, and then the regulations will get implemented. It's not an easy one to implement because there are many ways to bypass it, right? And what happens is that you have a lot of, you have a lot of, and again, this was happening with sort of the EPR space earlier also. Before there was proper licensing or registration of players, anyone could go and build so tomorrow morning I can go and tell somebody, hey, I'll build a STP for you, right? And I'm going to undercut the other person by 5%. I get the business. I build a piece of junk that doesn't work for 6 months. And the person gets a sign off for their occupation certificate that they've got a STP. Nobody will ever come back after that and check. Or if they come to inspect, you pay some money and they sign off and they go away. So I think that, I think there's a role for civil society, for third party players. When we talk about the government, I think, more and more, I think we all will recognize that the role of the government is to regulate, to coordinate, and to monitor. And I think there the job is not being done very well. Yes, it's not just a central government issue.
I think Manas has, but I will add to this while he joins back, so we can continue on the topic by the time he comes back. I think in the EPR, what we saw was since regulation came in and the registration actually started for people to apply and regulate how much everybody was using as a plastic material. Same way, I think 2 days back, there was a notification which came in where every society or a residential complex or an entity needs to register all their groundwater drawing tube wells and everything across the country on a government portal. So government is now going to regulate all the water drawing from the ground, which would essentially allow them to, bring in a lot of control over the sewage generation as well. Yes, Manas, I was just adding to that point. Please go on.
Thanks. Sorry about that. So I think from a regulatory perspective, regulations are headed in the right direction. There will be some hiccups. I think there are a lot of spaces, like, for bulk generators, if you have industrial customers, large real estate developers, it's already a very safe market. And that's why you have a lot of private players who are already in this business. But we need to push it to the next level, which is what's happening with the wastewater reuse. And that's the third regulatory problem. How do you trust the wastewater unit, the treatment manager, that they will actually treat the water properly and reuse it fairly? So therefore the government said, look, zero liquid discharge, right? You can't reuse it, you can't sell it. And I think that's a big loss because there are a lot of micro markets, especially where tanker water is expensive and a lot of water is used for non-potable or non-contact applications where treated water really could be used. And the technology is very good. Today, if you go to a 5-star hotel, the tap water is drinkable. It is probably recycled water. Your flush water is recycled. All that is drinkable water, right? You will not fall sick. So the technology is there. Sometimes it can be expensive, but we do need, we do need better regulations for it to scale up.
I think Manas has given us the sensational headline we needed on this, panel to summarize it for Deepanshi later. That more of us need to possibly be thrown in jail for not doing enough, and that's what it'll take to get the sector the attention it deserves. So, Wolfgang, with that, let me pose this to you, right? The Indian startup ecosystem is really going through a very, very vibrant phase right now. We're seeing exciting innovation across the board, a lot of great quality entrepreneurial talent. And a lot of this has been spurred by the use of technology, right? Technology which didn't exist earlier, or sort of ideas which are groundbreaking in that sense. So in your portfolio of multiple investments in India in the waste management space in the last year and a half, what is the use of technology that you see, and what is the role that you see it playing going forward as well?
I guess slightly different to a lot of the other sectors. Technology, yes, plays a role. And yes, of course, we see I would call them almost low-level software applications for traceability, for routing, and these things are constantly innovated and constantly get better. However, I would say you cannot build a business model purely on that, because a lot in the waste management space is hardcore execution. It's not sitting in a fancy office and developing some software code and thinking that's going to work out. It's hard work outside and making the nitty-gritty details work. So yes, technology has a supportive function in a lot of ways. And of course, we see high tech also. I mean, Sandeep mentioned that there is a strong ambition to get higher quality recycled material. And of course, that's pure high tech, which is used there in terms of machinery to get to that higher quality recycled material. But that's high tech of a different nature, I would say, than what we normally think about when we talk about high tech. Of course, we see on the technology side a lot of things around robotics as well, and attempts to improve sorting and things like that. I would say on that side, India has just I don't want to call it competitive advantage, because that would be unfair, but there's a lot of cheap labor around, which makes robotics in many ways less attractive than you might see that in Japan, in Europe, or the US. So there is a lot of efforts to bring the costs down, and we see interesting things. Is it investable at the moment? It starts to be interesting. So I would say along the supply chain, we see different use of technology, but I would say the most important use to do what we're out there to do to really scale that sector is high capex investments in heavy machinery, more on the processing side, and that's very different to the startup-y tech nature that we see in many other areas. Because there, I would say, I almost don't want to say it, the need for innovation is not the absolute biggest problem, because we have this technology available. I think a big problem in the past was that there have been close to no investors. I mean, you said Avishkar has been one of the first ones, and well, for a long time, one of the only ones who invested more significant amounts. I mean, for these hardworking family businesses, in many ways, they needed the investment capital to be able to buy the machinery to then get to that next level. And there is a huge need still going forward. We're just at the very, very, very beginning of that. So there will be billions that have to be invested to get that huge country of India to that real next level of waste management. And I mean, it's great to be there at the beginning of something like that happening. And I think there is a lot of enthusiasm around that. But I think all of us around here are just here because we know that we're at the very beginning of that huge story, which hopefully will play out over the next, I would most probably say, decades to get to that next scale.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Anurag, let me turn to you with the point Wolfgang made, that this is a segment that actually will remain capex intensive, and it requires deep-pocketed, thoughtful investors to come in with that view and pump in capital to build businesses with possibly longer gestation periods. So, in your experience of both helping NEPRA reach the scale that it is at today and looking at other businesses in the space, what would your advice be to other investors who look at this sector and go, well, it's capital intensive, plus it's dependent on government. It has that interlinkage with governments, and we don't want to touch anything that has that component. Rather than understanding that the government regulation is actually a massive tailwind driving this segment, right? So, what would be your, perspectives to other investors on that?
Yeah, so if we go back to the time when we made the commitment to NEPRA, NEPRA was a very, very manual intervention, and I think we realized very quickly that while it was very labor intensive and it was involving a lot of people, we realized very quickly that if we have to scale this and the opportunity set that was in front of us, that manual way of working, of segregating, is not really going to work, right? And I think we took the call fairly early on that we need to mechanize this and get the best of technology. So, we have very high-end optical sorters that we are importing from Germany right now. We have, these assembly lines where we are able to process fairly large quantities of waste. We have plants that can process 100 metric tons per day. We have plants that can process 300 metric tons, and it's very modular. So you can keep building that out city by city, within a city, to whatever extent. So when it comes to capital, what is important is, and in fact, it's a big selling point for us, that you need to demonstrate that it is capital efficient, right? Unit economics are strong. You're able to get to a break-even point quickly, and you are able to generate a return on that capital employed. That's the traditional metric that any investor will look at. And if you are able to demonstrate that, which we have been able to, keep in mind, so we've kept that very squarely on board. And in short, unlike today's business where people are still trying to figure out from where the unit economics will come, we've kept a very, very keen eye on the unit economics. So if you can do that, then I think capital is not really a constraint. If the capital efficiency is there, because there is more than enough capital going around in the world, it just doesn't know where to go. So we have fairly, as you know, fairly good unit economics on that capital. So there is enough and more capital that will follow, and which has been the case with NEPRA. So I don't think there's any dearth of capital that would come in, as long as the unit economics stays strong. As far as the government engagement is concerned, I think Manas put it very rightly. I think he used something like the government's role is to regulate, facilitate, monitor. I don't remember exactly what words he used, but our thought process has been that the government can be a big facilitator, which again, as you rightly said, with all the regulation and the push that is coming from the government, we see that as huge positive for our business. But we were very clear right from the beginning, and we have burnt our hands where we've had government as the primary customer. That's where we try to avoid that kind of a situation. And again, that's more linked to transparency and practices. But if those can improve, then even that's not really strict no. But so far, given the state of things, we've generally stayed away from businesses where government becomes the primary payer for is the primary buyer, and the business is completely dependent on its revenue on the government. So there we've stayed away from it, but we do have fairly high engagement with the government in terms of taking municipal corporation permissions. They're even leasing us land to set up our plants. So we are engaging with them. They are even supplying the waste to us. In fact, we are paying the government instead of government paying us. So that's the model that we've created with NEPA specific. We won't shy away from anything which is dealing with the government, but we don't want it to be 100% dependent on the government.
Got it. So that makes a lot of sense. And yes, it's obviously great to have a team like Sandeep and Dhrumin, who tell us on an average day, listen, I don't know how to burn money. So I only know one way to run this business, which is to keep an eye on the bottom line. Sandeep, let me ask you that question, right? We've spoken of policy, regulations, we've spoken of technology, of capital availability. The other core tenet of building a business remains people. So tell us a little bit about, and I know that you do mentor a lot of other budding entrepreneurs in the waste management space who look up to you for being one of the early entrants and having that decade of experience. So tell us a little bit about both what you're seeing on the entrepreneurial talent side and your own journey of finding talent to work in the waste management space, given that it's absolutely the opposite of being anything glamorous. It requires somebody to really get their hands dirty. So how do you see somebody overcome that challenge?
See, I think every business has different challenges at every stage of business. So when we were very early, it was very hands-on. So even explaining and standardizing the roles and responsibility was always a challenge because everybody was doing everything at the same time. We were able to communicate and solve problems. And as you grow, the challenge becomes that you need to have professionals who are able to align to the business, understand the nitty-gritties of the business, and it evolves. And once you cross that stage, then you also have that structure where you will be able to train the same thing to other professionals. So I think we have been going at every scale of business. We have been learning all this stuff and improvising on those things, and we continuously do that. With respect to waste management entrepreneurs, I think about 10 years back, there were hardly number of people you could count on your fingertips. Today, there are so many number of companies which have started, entrepreneurs have got into the space that even if somebody tells you, do you know this company in this part of the country? And I would say, no, I have not heard about them. So that is the speed at which people are getting into the space. And I think that is a good sign. Why? Because that's when the effort which everybody else is making will have positive impact on each other. Ecosystem creation will happen, and definitely in a lot of firms and a lot of entrepreneurs do reach out to me to find out what we did about 6-7 years back at that particular stage of business where they are today, and how did we tackle issues with people on the ground or in the collection space, etc. And we do share our experience in a frank way because what we realize is in this sector, unless and until a person doesn't really experience it, it's not going to have from day one a standardized process. They will go through the same challenges which we did. Of course, it took us about 6-7 years to reach where we have reached. They might reach there in 3 years. They might reach, but the challenges will continue to remain the same because tech is just an enabler. Like Wolfgang said, you can make softwares, but to use the software with people and implement better processes and experience better quality material, you need that kind of journey to really handle those issues and manage the waste better. And I think it's all about managing the waste better, and the rest all is an enabler. So, I do get once a week somebody from the sector reaching out saying, I want 10 minutes or 5 minutes of yours, and say, okay, we have this challenge. How do we solve it? What did you do? So it's like a ready reckoner for a lot of people. They just reach out with a problem and would say, okay, tell us what you did, and we will try to do that. So it's good one way because end of the day I do realize sharing experience is going to be important to create more entrepreneurs in this space, to create that ecosystem. At the same time, it's an infrastructure play. So we were lucky to have people backing us at various stages of business. Today, the business models which I could not believe could exist are coming into play. People are creating those business models with their own strengths and all. So it's becoming interesting day by day. And I think with more people coming in, it becomes a very unique industry where successes will become much better over a period of time.
Interesting. So,
founders
in the audience, I'd say Sandeep is a great guy to speak with if you're even thinking of starting up in this space. He'll tell you 10 reasons why you shouldn't, but he'll also tell you 20 ways in which he can be helpful if you do decide to dive in. Sorry, I think Wolfgang, you wanted to step in?
Actually, Aditi, I just want to add something to what Sandeep just said. And there's a wonderful book by a guy called Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust. And he said there are 3 things that motivate people. There is pleasure, there is power, and there is purpose, right? And I think for people who have walked this journey, whether it's Anurag at Avishkar or Sandeep or somebody like Wolfgang, I think, creating that sense of purpose in especially the younger people, but even the older people today, who have got experience, who have got, lots of capabilities. I think that's really the biggest challenge we have. And so, so it's not just about sharing how do we build a better wastewater or a waste treatment business, but really sort of inspiring that sense of responsibility which I think is something we also need to talk about a lot more and do, because that is what will get people, out of chasing other kind of jobs into saying, look, let's do this, instead, right? And I think that's going to be very important for all of us going forward as we build these businesses and change so the kind of awful metrics that we see in India, right? I mean, we are literally at the bottom of every ranking that matters. We come close to the bottom. So there's definitely a lot of work ahead for us to do.
And maybe just to add to that on the people aspect, we've seen that earlier, maybe 10 years ago, a lot of people were wanting to get into the space more from a purpose perspective. I want to do something meaningful. But today, I think that has changed quite dramatically. Actually, people are seeing opportunity, and they're excited by even the monetary aspect of what one can do in something which was perhaps earlier not seen as that attractive. Say something like waste management or even sanitation. So we are seeing a lot of new entrepreneurs in these areas who are just purely excited from a monetary perspective as well. So the opportunity itself is making it very exciting.
Sure thing.
Absolutely. So as the sort of size of pie grows, it also attracts, more people from the commercial viability and wealth creation perspective. So great to see that talent. And Wolfgang, you have funded, at Circulate Capital, very diverse sort of teams over the last year and a half, right? It has the kind of entrepreneurs you were just speaking of who come from maybe a technology background, have no background in the space of waste management, but are compelled because of a strong sense of purpose of wanting to do something which has climate impact. On the other hand, you have, family-run businesses which have been in operations for a while. And it's the second generation which is taken over and is looking to grow at a different pace, which is where private sector capital kicks in. So what sort of differences do you see in motivation or, journeys of these teams? Is it very similar, or does that perspective lend itself to how they think of growth differently?
I don't know if it's the distinction necessarily between those who have come from technology and those who have run family businesses, but I think what's important to recognize just as a fact to work with is the fact that family-run businesses are thinking and acting very differently compared to venture-funded or private equity-funded businesses. And I think in the waste management space, at the state where we are at in India, in my personal opinion, that's the biggest challenge that we have. Because when you're funded by private equity, there is an expectation that you're investing today in something which will work out tomorrow, without having that 100% assurance that will work out. You're expected to build a really strong team before you might even need all of these strong team members, because you're expected to grow extremely fast. Whereas a family business is not necessarily driven by the fact that they have to grow extremely fast, but they are driven by, I want to survive in a good way. And surviving in a good way is managed completely different than growing extremely fast, bringing top people on board, and then basically planning far ahead, already having in mind, okay, in 5 to 8 years, I want to exit. What do I have to do today to meet my milestones over these next 2-3 years to then be able to grow that significantly? That's a completely different mindset and approach. And that cultural shift is what I would say we spend most of our time on at the moment. And if you ask me for a difference, if a tech entrepreneur comes into that space and has gone through that journey in his previous life, where they have been successful 2 times, 3 times, being venture funded or private equity funded, then they have just seen that journey and they already know what to expect 3 years, 5 years out. And that's just a huge difference. And I think a responsibility that we all as investors have is to guide on that journey as good as possible, because we know that it's emotionally for these entrepreneurs very difficult, because they have not been used to get real external support. And they always doubt, okay, are these guys really serious? Are they really in the best interest for me, or are they just acting in their own best interest? And to build such a trusted relationship, when you don't know 100% what's going to happen in 3 years, is very difficult for them to accept. So that's where we spend most of our time on. And for the foreseeable future, I think the phase that we're in India, that's going to be a major challenge for us. Once these people have gone through their first journeys, they might do it once more again, because then they love it, then they know what to expect, and the second and third time will be way easier. But that's not, let me say that that's not a waste-specific problem. That's a problem all around the world, where we work with people who are for the first time venture or private equity funded, because it's a very different approach. And to get mentors on that journey is what we have learned is the most helpful. Like Sandeep is now mentoring a lot of startup entrepreneurs, because he has gone through that journey. So he can look back 10 years and can say, well, if I would have known at the beginning what I should expect 3-5 years out, I would have done a few things, most probably a little bit different. And that's exactly what we need, I guess, right now. People who have gone through that whole journey up to a successful IPO a couple of times, and then can basically give their advice. So that's where when we talk about talent, that's where a big challenge is ahead. And I mean, maybe just one other sentence to Anurag when we discussed capital availability. I would say thanks to Avishkar's work of having created a first success story really with Nepra, and thanks to now more investors coming into that space, that for the first time attracts additional investors. But we shouldn't fool ourselves. Literally over the last 2-3 years, and I would even say honestly over the last 12 months, for the first time, these entrepreneurs can choose not only among 2-3 capital providers, but it starts to really play out, and there's 5-10 ones that are there. And that's what I want to see, because there has to be, I mean, if I'm an entrepreneur myself as well, so I want to be able to choose my investor, and I don't want to be dependent. If it doesn't work with that one, I'm basically out of options. So what I see over the next years is 10, 20, 30, 50 investors who are very active in that space. And also not to confuse, when I talk about investors, there's a lot of people at the moment who do kind of angel-like investments. And that's very needed and very good, but not enough for a Nepra, a Lucro, a Shishakra anymore. They need 5 to 20 in the future, 30 to 100 million to really grow their businesses. And I think capital availability for me is always, is it there at the right stage with the right experience? Because it's not about just capital. I mean, it's way more than capital. And that's what I see now slowly being created. And I'm optimistic about that sector, because I think these first success stories now crowd in more and more people as entrepreneurs, as investors, and also as support on all these other services that you need along the supply chain, without which it's not possible. I mean, it's not the hero entrepreneur or the hero investor or whatever. It's all of these people who have to be able to work together to make these things successful. And that's what makes me more optimistic for that sector than ever.
Absolutely, Wolfgang. I'm so glad you make the point, because, when anybody asks me what are the biggest changes you've seen in the overall ecosystem over the last 10 years, I think the biggest change from broader perspective has been the number of second-time founders that we have in other sectors of education, sometimes healthcare, other consumer tech sectors. which has led to greater negotiating power now being in the hands of the founders versus investors, lower information asymmetry across the board, and just greater incentive for good behavior, across the ecosystem. So that depth is still to translate into waste management as a sector, but hopefully there is a strong foundation being set with players here and those listening in, and we can build on that in the decade to come and get to that same stage of agency for founders in this sector as well. I think we have a very engaged audience. We've got a bunch of interesting questions, so let me take those up now, and I'll pose it to the panel. Our panelists, please feel free to take it up. So the first one that's super interesting is that what are your views on using recyclable goods or plastic credits as a form of currency? Do you see a market for an exchange there, whether as a regulated exchange or a currency which could be used, let's say, for insurance premiums for health or life insurance? I think there's a case study in Africa of a company which does that. So would love to get your thoughts on, is there a possibility of creating a trading engine here which could spur greater incentives?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
See, I think the plastic take back and the EPR, the rules are still not stabilized. Okay, so the process is still evolving. So anything which needs to be converted into a currency would require very stable policy and a process both. And I think it will take a couple of years where it will streamline, but definitely there would be an opportunity to create a platform for trading of credits, but to a great extent it would be only surplus one, because otherwise most of the entities would want consistency in their sourcing. So buying and selling would not really come up in near future, one or 2 years, but it will definitely come up maybe next 2-3 years time, when the process and the government policy on EPR take back and reporting and compliance would start shaping up. And the other part of using the same credit for buying stuff and doing is more of a rewarding mechanism, which definitely should be kept. I believe it would be two different things, because plastic credit would be used mainly for either compliance or for mitigation of their personal liabilities towards contaminating the earth with plastic waste. So those two things will remain separately, but definitely it will evolve as time passes, but I don't see that happening in the next 6-12 months time.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Sandeep in the sense that you said the rules are not stable yet. I would say we see, and that's a good thing for me, that the government is learning with what's happening and is adapting things and is refining things and is bringing that to a next level. And I would say I expect that to continue over the next years, because there is still a number of important open questions around these topics. Talk about, starts with verifying what's done in that huge sector, which is not always as transparent as we would wish. I mean, I guess it gets better and better. Traceability gets better and better. And I think one of the roles that we see is work with partners who are leaping in that area, and hopefully the others come by. There's this next huge topic, and that's most probably one of the biggest for me, is attribution. Who really deserves that? And that's then strongly connected. How are these credits or certificates or the income through that, how is that distributed in the supply chain? Because just because a processor processes does not mean he deserves the whole credit, because there is a waste picker who had to pick that stuff. There is someone then in the supply chain got it from that waste picker, and 3-4 stages up, a larger collector, and then you have someone sorting it, and then you have something processing it. So for me, there's this huge issue of attribution, which is, I don't think, solved at all. There is the huge issue of avoiding that it gets to a downward spiral in terms of pricing. So what is the price for a specific material? Huge other issue where I would hope that government sooner or later say, okay, well, we might have to set a price to avoid that gets too cheap and no one benefits from all of that, or said differently, that it really incentivizes large companies to do something about it and think about it, because a couple of rupees is nice, but does it really change people to think about how they can reduce? I doubt. So I see lots of opportunities in that, but I see also lots of open questions in that. And on a macro level, as an investor, I ask myself, do I prefer that my company spend an awful lot of time on adding a few rupees to their top line, or do I want them to basically replicate the huge efforts that they have in another 10 cities, in another 20, in another 50 cities? So it's a question of focus. And when I see the opportunities that Anepra has and all of our other portfolio companies have, I would say they're super busy to day and night think about how they can replicate their excellent efforts in other places, and that growth is significantly higher. If then we have a bit coming on top of that, I don't mind, but taking the, let's say, the total size of that in combination with the unsolved questions, and having seen how that evolved in the carbon markets not too successfully over the last decades, I have a clear view on what the teams should focus on. But at the end of the day, everyone will take their own decisions, and we will support wherever possible. But that's where I'm coming from there.
Got it. So I think greater stability in the regulation and traceability space before we can have something being traded in the plastic space is what I hear our panel telling us. The next one, Manas, and let me post this to you, is a question on what do you think of, waste management at a decentralized level versus interventions which happen at a centralized level? Do you think it varies based on what is the kind of waste that one is talking about? Because we also have a question, around agro stubble and stubble burning as a pain point. So what do you think of, decentralized models, given that what you're working on does work mostly on decentralized model?
So philosophically, I believe a lot in decentralization. I think the more we solve problems closer to the source, the better off the solutions are going to be, and the better off we can prevent a lot of the problems that come with aggregation, transportation, and dealing with a point problem, right? Now, having said that, one has to look at what is the right technology, what are the costs of decentralization also. Because we have seen efforts where you try to decentralize, but if you can't monitor it properly or the technology costs go too high, then again, your unit economics goes for a toss. Nobody's willing to pay for it, and things will not work. So I think the decentralization has to go hand in hand with technology and costs and the economics of doing it. But fundamentally, at a principal level, I think decentralization is the way to go. In the water space, for example, you can think about it, right? If you generate 1 million liters a day of treated wastewater, you have a chance to reuse it productively. If you're going to generate 100 million liters of wastewater at one single point, now what do you do with so much water, right? You have to just discharge it, because it's very hard then to pump that back to users at different places for different quality. Also, when you mix things up, you create problems, because then the contamination happens. So I think overall decentralization is definitely the way to go. And a lot of our efforts at Borda have been around how to create the technologies that make decentralization both safe, so they can be easily monitored, and make it affordable, so it becomes economically viable. Stubble burning, honestly, something that I think it's an issue that I don't have as much. I mean, I've got views on it, but not necessarily very well informed views, so I won't make any comments on that. But I can certainly speak for solid waste and for liquid waste.
Got it. I think it's also one of those areas where politics has come in and sort of muddied waters, right? So it's not really a business view standalone, but which way your politics lean possibly.
Absolutely.
But Sandeep, let me pose the next one to you, which is an area that I know you think about. How does multi-layered plastic compare in its carbon footprint versus other plastic, and what does the last leg of the life cycle of multi-layered plastic look like?
See, presently, most of it goes to either landfills, and whatever is done under EPR would go to cement kilns or waste to energy for processing. With the kind of investments which are being made into creating infrastructure for creating boards and other articles and granules of high nature, there is a transition of recovery of clean multi-layer packaging, that is post-consumer clean multi-layer packaging, where economics are being created now. So I think as more infrastructure gets created, more demands get created, and at the same time, at the design level also, the multi-layer packaging would be shifting to single polymer families or even wherever it is going to be MLP, the content of PE or PP would be increased, or it will be visibly available that what is the composition of the particular multi-layer packaging. Infrastructure for low-end applications and high-end applications both are being evolved. A lot of entrepreneurs, Wolfgang and team, are already working with many of them who are creating boards of high grade to be used for various applications in automotive sector, in the interior designing sector, and construction, etc. So there are good quality products coming out from MLP, but at the same time, the sourcing and large scale diversion from landfill or incineration would require a lot of infrastructure to be created for segregating MLP separately, because MLP's density being very low, and to recover good quality and quantity both of MLP would be required. It would have a lot of effort also on washing the MLP, because most of the MLP is packed for either small sachets of shampoo, wafers, so it might have oils or shaving creams, etc. So a lot of load on water treatment would also we need to be considered. So we don't have answer for it today that how MLP washing would really evolve, because the quantum or the types of content which are packaged into it would typically have high fatty content or high chemical content into it, which would have a huge impact on water. So the technologies for water treatment need to be looked more in detail for washing of MLP, because technologies for processing of clean MLP would evolve very fast, and they do exist. So if you have a clean MLP, the technologies from Arima, Starlinger, they do have good quality granules which could be made, but only post washing of MLP. So it's a I think the value chain and the process of deciding what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, and how that scale would be achieved to really do that stuff for post consumer. For post industrial, it is possible, and a lot of people are still doing it today. And we expect, as more interest in MLP conversion into products gets into play, the value chain will start evolving the same way it has evolved for other commodities as well.
Got it. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, so I'll take this one since it covers an area we didn't speak about. So we've got a question around electronic waste, right? Electronic and batteries, right? So that's an area that's going to become another large value chain in the years to come. So what sort of innovation are we seeing there, and what are our perspectives as investors or operators on that?
Okay, so see, I think EVs, because of government policies coming up, a lot of battery waste generation would happen. With respect to e-waste, the quality of e-waste or the kind of metal usage in e-waste has evolved a lot. So if you look back at the TVs which we had about 15 years back, would have a lot of copper content and precious metals. Today's the technology which is being used for manufacturing PCBs, the quantity and the quantum of precious metals would have decreased considerably. So I think the technologies are evolving fast. E-waste is going to be a huge sector, but at the same time, it will still struggle with, similar to what most of the waste stream struggle is for aggregation and segregation. So it's both going to be continuous challenge, because to get into mainstream in authorized value chain is still a problem. E-waste actually ends up being in the unorganized sector to a great extent. Just on the paper trail, it would be officially being processed. And for EVs, I think it's more of a very high-end technical subject. So a lot of large players would invest in chemical processing and technologies for separating out lead and nickel, cadmium, and all those things would be forming, and it would allow, as quantum builds up, to create processing facilities. And I know a couple of people are already looking and exploring these opportunities as well.
Just to add to what, sorry, Wolfgang, you want to say something?
Go for it. I'll add then.
Okay. No, I just wanted to add to what Sandeep was saying. So at Avishkar also, we see this electric mobility as a big trend, as a mega trend over the next 10 years. And this translates into a big opportunity, whether it comes to vehicles themselves or second use batteries or recycling of the battery materials as well. I think the tech angle there is evolving. I think there is some very high-end tech. A lot of this is happening actually in China. A lot of that processing capability currently is concentrated in China. But we are seeing that as a very, very massive opportunity as an investment area. If there is appropriate technology and somebody can, it will need to happen at scale. So it will require large quantum of capital. So it's not going to be, even at a very, very startup kind of a stage, it's not going to be a 2 million, 5 million kind of a check in Series A. So you need to back the entrepreneurs with large capital to set up something at scale, which is then viable. But we see that as a massive opportunity. In fact, we are looking at a couple of opportunities in that space as we speak.
Maybe a last sentence here. I hope that over the next 4 to 8 weeks, you'll see an announcement about an investment exactly in that space that we will do. One of our next 2 investments are exactly in that space, but we came more from a plastic perspective at the beginning because the casings of these batteries, polypropylene, and 8 to 10% in every battery is plastic, which is currently not recycled, but very often burned. And that's just ridiculous because there is a resource which we can comparatively easily recycle at high quality. And so that was our original take on that, to use battery recycling as a launch pad to do more around PP at the end of the day. Having said that, the technology that we will invest in is going to change a few things in that battery recycling space as well. And so from both perspectives, highly interesting, and looking forward to do more there.
Excellent. So that's a great note of optimism to end our session on. I want to thank all our panelists for a very engaging session where hopefully we've inspired more founders to take up building in this space, because there's just so much value to be unlocked. And as you can see, there is capital that's going to flow in, because it's a segment that's inevitable in its existence, right? It's recessionary, it's linked to sort of the macroeconomic growth of the country. So you couldn't be on the wrong side of this. I also hope that, we've busted some myths around the technical aspects of it, covering different value chains. So in the years to come, may many more businesses in waste management bloom. With that, Dipanshi, over to you.
Thank you, Aditi, for a fantastic moderation, I must say. And thank you, panelists, for an eye-opening discussion. Very interesting points being surfaced. Definitely a lot of takeaways for me. But one very important takeaway definitely was the policy in this particular sector has been a key lever. And as Sandeep rightly put it, earlier every stakeholder was playing a different tune, but the rhythm is slowly setting in now. So a lot of stakeholders in the ecosystem, including large corporates, are better aligned. And the intent is definitely getting translated as we see, policies like EPR getting stronger. However, we need better and stricter implementation. We also see new technologies in areas beyond solid waste also emerging in the sector, such as wastewater treatment and plastic waste. Overall, a lot of positive, I would say, outlook for the entrepreneurs, because now it seems like they can also, find commercial returns. From the commercial return point of view, they can find the sector more attractive. Thank you all for this amazing discussion.